Welcome back, everyone, after your networking break. You are in an amazing summit today. It's the Equality, Diversion and Inclusion Summit, focusing on towards a fairer working world. And we had an amazing first session just before. We were talking about workplace of the future, what that might look like. We're now coming to a session that focuses on how data and analytics can transform the world of work through positive action. And just a reminder and an encouragement to keep those questions coming. We had 3 fantastic questions in the last session, and thank you for those who posed those questions. Put them into the chat box. We will deal with them as we are able to during the session or towards the end of this session. So I'm joined by 3 speakers for today's session: Anit Chandarana from Network Rail, Marcus Bell from the Cabinet Office, and Ian Adams from NHS Resolution. I'll start by introducing Marcus, who is Director of the Equality Hub in the Cabinet Office, which brings together the Government Equalities Office, the Race Disparity Unit, the Disability Unit, and the Social Mobility Commission. Marcus has more than 30 years of service in civil service policy roles and has a particular interest in social policy and improving the use of data and evidence. So clearly an obvious choice and a great choice for today's panel. Marcus's background is mainly in education and social reform. He's worked in the past for the UK government on schools, teenage pregnancy, drugs, alcohol, children in care, unemployment, geospatial data and prisons. And he is chair of governors of a primary school, which he's helped lead out of special measures. And Ian is Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement for NHS Resolution. His experience includes as a charity trustee, a social housing non-executive director, further education college governor and local councillor, including an earlier career with the BBC. And he sits on the board of Unite Foundation, which supports family estranged students into university. He's also a registered mentor with NHS Leadership Academy, Civil Service LGBT+ mentoring scheme, and Government Communications Service. So welcome to Marcus and Ian. Now, ironic for a session that focuses on data and technology, but we're having a little bit of trouble getting connected with Anit. I don't know whether this is a firewall issue, that he's inside a civil service bunker somewhere and can't get through, but as and when Anit is able to join us, we'll bring him into the conversation and I'll introduce him then, if that's okay with everyone. Well, it has to be okay with everyone because that's how I'm going to do it. So welcome, Marcus, Ian. Wonderful to have you here. We've got quite a meaty topic that we're going to be discussing in this session. And the areas that we might want to talk about include things like why it's important for leaders to understand their role in data and analytics, which I think is a really interesting topic because we often just think leaders are the passive recipients of data, but they actually have a role to play, don't they? We also could look at things like how to build a mindset that's data-driven and what that looks like in practice, and also how the power of data can drive diversity and transform business. So I have mixed feelings about data. I'm going to be very upfront with you. I think on the one hand, data can be incredibly important and also the least important thing, because it often is presented as an alternative to lived experience. Because lived experience is unreliable somehow, but data isn't. But I mentioned this phrase, I don't know if either of you heard earlier, we were talking about, lies, damned lies and statistics. And I did share a couple of stats earlier, which I might just repeat again before we kick off, which is that some work done by My Kind of Future revealed that the employment rate for people from minority ethnic groups fell 5.3% up to September 2020. Compared with 0.2% for white employees. That's 5.3% for minority ethnic people. That's the experience, the drop in employment they experienced. The Institute for Fiscal Studies found that mothers were 23% more likely than fathers to become unemployed during the pandemic. And then there was a City of London survey which found that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds take on average 25% longer to get promoted than people from a higher socioeconomic background. And if you're black and from a lower socioeconomic background, that rises to 32%. takes 32% longer to get promoted. So those were just a few framing statistics I shared at the very start of today's session. But I wonder, perhaps, Ian, do you want to kick us off? Because I know that one of the things that you are interested in is how to make leaders accountable through the use of data, what role that can play in governance, and what the key kind of mechanics of that are, and perhaps share a bit about how NHS Resolution has been using data to drive performance.
Right, thank you, David. I hope you can all hear me. Well, first of all, huge thanks to the Civil Service College for inviting me along today to get into what David quite rightly describes as a really meaty topic. I won't bore you with any more words about myself. Thanks to David for his kind introduction on that side. But just briefly, what do NHS Resolution do? We are effectively the NHS's in-house insurer across England. So we provide indemnity to every single GP practice in England and every single NHS trust and foundation trust in England. And we're an approximate £2.5 billion turnover business. So that's the amount of clinical and staff and public risk that we are currently managing on behalf of the system. So just to put a context there. I mean, first and foremost, just to come back on David's opening response around his view of data, and I agree with you, David, it is a potentially quite a polarizing subject matter. On one level, one can argue that the data provide a robust evidence base for change and intervention. On the other, you might regard data as a distraction from what's going on in the real world. And I think one needs to be very cautious of potentially drawing out false conclusions, false positives, if you will, from data sets, particularly in terms of an ED&I context, not least giving an example around the pandemic a moment ago. And I think that the key point of any data set, from my experience, is to ask that fundamental, very basic question: why? What's happening and why? And that gets you into the what can we do about it? I think my point, and I'm going to start off talking about data at a kind of corporate board level, accountability level, given my role on both corporate boards as a director, exec director, and as a NED, as you mentioned earlier, and trustee. So I think fundamentally, at a very basic opening level, to get the discussion going today, I think organisations clearly have a legal responsibility for compliance in terms of data capture, data reporting, data returns. So examples of that within an NHS setting, and it's not exclusive to the NHS, but obviously I'll wear my corporate NHS hat today, very proudly to do so, of course. We corporately sign up to a number of regular data reporting parameters. There's the workforce, race, equality, and also we're just getting into, and I'm pleased we are now getting into, the workforce disability employment standard as well. So RES and WDES are two important aspects of how the NHS as an employer is responding to legal, quasi-legal based issues around equality, diversity, and equity in the workplace. And then, of course, another obvious point of reference impacting employers writ large is the gender pay gap reporting as well. So I think corporately, UK PLC, and I include the public sector in that as well, of course, we are maturing, we're growing up as a nation, as a system, if you like, in terms of our regular data capture reporting. But it still, I think, opens up the discussion, and I'll hand the baton back to Dave for any responses from myself or Marcus around well, what does it all mean? What does it stack up to, other than obvious points around tracking year-on-year change? But it does come back to the why and the so what questions, I think.
And I think it's a great point you raised there, Ian, around year on year, because I've seen so many examples of data quoted, and I'm kind of guilty of doing it myself just then, a 1 year snapshot of something. Well, that's great, but what's the trend over time is a simple question that managers and leaders could be asking, couldn't it, to get a better perspective? Because just measuring one step in a movement doesn't really give you a lot of insight, does it? The obvious case being, these numbers are rising. Oh, well, that looks great. But when you bring the lens out, you realize they're rising within an overall trend of a fall. And it's a bit like looking at the stock market, isn't it? You know, if you look at your stock and it's rising, you think, oh, that's amazing. But, you know, actually it's been tumbling for the last 5 years. That gives you a slightly different picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the classic thing that we all get drawn into falsely is house price rises, of course, which is a complete minefield, you know, in terms of getting falsely drawn into a sense of security and financial wealth, when, of course, you know, you look around you and actually the whole market's risen much more than you might think.
You know, and again, if we keep that analogy going, it may be that house prices are rising, but the value of the money you earn is falling, you know, inflation and so on. And so actually this false sense of, wow, my house is worth £1 million now, but guess what? You know, the money you earn isn't worth very much. I'm going to bring Marcus in a second, because I know you've got some perspectives on what data does and doesn't tell you and how to interpret it. But just sort of maybe as a bridge to that conversation, I wonder, Ian, if you had any closing thoughts around how important it is for the data we look at to recognise that people are affected by multiple aspects of diversity and their identity. And, you know, we just had one of them then when I quoted that example around lower socioeconomic background. But if you then add in ethnicity, the impact changes, doesn't it? It becomes that, you know, it takes even longer for a black person from a lower socioeconomic background to get promoted. So how good are we at recognizing those cross-sectionalities? Because you mentioned a number of important dimensions there around race, around disability, around gender and the gender pay gap. But what does it look like when you put all of those together? And is that something we're any good at?
I think that kind of intersectional point, if I can use a bit of jargon there, David, I think you're right to shine a bit of a light on that, actually. I mean, just opening up the race aspect, just to give a practical example. So I recently was a member of an NHS Academy-sponsored group of both black men and white men meeting up in a sort of safe space. We call it a kind of allies group. And this is an example of getting away from the hard elements of data, hard stats, into the more qual end of data. You know, what's the actual lived experience of, in this case, black men within a complex employment system, i.e. the NHS, and what were the reasons from their own lived experience perspectives, absolutely valid data set, data capture, data reporting about why, generally speaking, black males in the NHS are the most disadvantaged section of the workforce when it comes to promotion and career development. And, you know, forgive me, but you can't get into that easily from numbers on a page. You really need to get into that more rounded qual discussion. But again, an absolutely valid way of getting into some of the more softer and absolutely valid intersectional points that would come up, I think, through those conversations.
So, Marcus, from your perspective, I know you've been looking at what data tells us and what it doesn't.
Yeah, thanks. So, I thought I'd do a sort of input specifically about ethnicity data and about the work of the Race Disparity Unit in the Cabinet Office, which for people who don't know, it's really a specialist statistical unit that looks at government ethnicity data. And it's worth saying we publish a huge amount of it. So there's a website called Ethnicity Facts and Figures. You might want to Google it. It should come up first in the list, Ethnicity Facts and Figures. So we publish data about 170 different metrics by ethnicity, and those are regularly updated and should have fairly recent data on them. So what I was going to try and talk about is what does all that data tell you about ethnicity? What does it not tell you? And what's a sensible way to interpret it? And I'm going to refer in the kind of sort of short talk I'm giving to data about policing and COVID and education, all of which are controversial topics, but I think are ways of sort of illustrating some key points about what the data doesn't tell you. And I'm slightly twitching rather, giving a talk about data without having any charts to show you, because obviously talking about data rather than showing it is slightly goes against the grain. But anyway, you can Google all the stuff I'm going to talk about and check if you want to. So I think really I just wanted to kind of land 4 points and then say a little bit about it at the end. So The first one is that ethnicity data can tell you some really important things about differences between ethnic minorities and the white population. And the kind of three things that I'd quote in relation to that are, first of all, some very interesting data about age and huge differences in the average age of different communities. So I just want to quote those because they're important for a point I want to make later on. So the average age of white people is 41. The average age of black people is 30. And the average age of Asian people is 29. So an actuary would tell you those aren't minor differences. Those are huge differences actually in the composition of different communities, and really important in interpreting some of the data, which is a point I'll come back to later on. So the second thing I just want to mention in terms of differences between the white population and ethnic minorities is on the policing data. So as is well known, there are really big differences in terms of the likelihood of ethnic minorities being stopped by the police and white people. Some really big differences there. There are also some also well-known differences in terms of COVID mortality and ethnic minorities, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. But in terms of the headline data, there appear to be some really big differences between outcomes for ethnic minorities and white people. So first point is ethnicity data does tell you some useful things about the white population, ethnic minorities in general. Second point I wanted to make is that the data also tells you some really important things about the differences between ethnic minority communities. So they are very far from being all the same on most metrics. And I think the two points, the main point I'd like to quote in relation to that is about education. In aggregate, I think ethnic minorities do marginally worse than the white population in terms of GCSE attainment. But if you break down ethnic minority into the different constituent groups, you get huge differences between the different communities. So Chinese people and Indians do quite a lot better than the white population at GCSE. Gypsies and Irish travellers do dramatically worse, indeed worse than any other community. So the worst performing community is a white ethnic minority. And there are also big differences between Black African and Black Caribbean. So I mean, I think my point for kind of insisting on that is one trap it's easy to fall into is to assume that data about ethnic minorities in aggregate is particularly useful, because probably it isn't. And if possible, it's a good idea to break it down and kind of see what's going on underneath. And just to plug the website briefly, it does allow you to do that on a lot of the metrics. I think the third point I wanted to make is about change over time. And I was glad that David quoted that stat about black people in unemployment, because I was going to mention it as well, but he already has. So, and I think the main point I want to land under this heading is that the position is frequently changing about ethnicity data and how different communities are faring on different metrics, and doesn't stay the same at all. So the two things I wanted to quote in support of that are, one was the unemployment figure. So it's quite correct that during the pandemic, the figures on black unemployment seem to have worsened quite significantly relative to white, which is concerning. It's equally true that between 2014 and 2019, the black unemployment rate fell very sharply and the white rate didn't. So that doesn't mean what's happening now isn't real. But I think if I was asked to explain why it was happening, I'd also want to understand why essentially that rate got better from 2014 to 19 and then got worse after 2020. Again, it doesn't tell you what's going on. I just think there's an important thing to think about there. The final one I wanted to quote was about COVID. And I mentioned earlier that in the first wave of COVID, so this is March to May 2020, there were clear differences between ethnic minorities and white people in terms of mortality. But I think it's worth saying that the precise pattern of mortality between different groups has been different in every successive wave. So it was different in wave 2 from wave 1. It looks like it's different in the current wave from in wave 2 and wave 1 as well. Not just in terms of the relative position of ethnic minorities and white people, but as between different ethnic minority groups. So in terms of headline statistics, wave 2, this was the winter wave, January to March, seems to have been significantly worse in South Asian communities, and actually the difference between black and white in terms of mortality seems to have really significantly reduced between wave 1 and wave 2. And again, I'm not saying that tells you exactly what's going on. It's just an important point to note about all the complicated things that are going on in the data. So that's the three main points I wanted to make about the data. First of all, the final point I really want to land is about how to interpret all this stuff. And the main thing I'd say about it is you need to interpret it with great care. Because the raw data, when I say raw data, I mean simply comparing outcomes for white people with outcomes for black people. While it can be very illuminating, and it's important to look at it, of course, it can also be quite misleading unless you think about other, as statisticians call these, confounding factors, but other factors that could explain why there's a difference. So I'm not saying this to explain away any differences. It's just, I think, to interpret them correctly, you need to look at other data at the same time if it's available. So examples I just wanted to quote are, first of all, age. So I mentioned earlier that there's a really big difference in the age composition of different ethnicities, but that's really important when you're looking at, for example, how well represented ethnic minorities are in particular senior positions. So if I quote the figure for judges, so I don't know whether you know what proportion of judges, High Court judges, are white, but the answer is 93%, which sounds staggeringly bad. And indeed, that is clearly unrepresentative, because the white population is 87 or 86 or 85%, depending on exactly how you calculate it. So that's way apart from where it ought to be. But of course, it takes 20 to 30 years to become a High Court judge. So I'm not trying to excuse anything, but I think that figure is partly where it is because High Court judges are typically not 30 or 35; they're 60 or 65, and so I think the only point I'm making is that that cohort is more that judges are more representative of their age cohort than you might think. And the point being, when looking at these stats, you need to think about the age as part of the background. Second thing it's really important to look at is geography. Because there is enormous geographical variation across the country, as we know. That's why levelling up is a big theme for the government and so on. But there are also really big differences in terms of outcomes for particular ethnic groups in different parts of the country, which, if you get into the detail of the data, it's kind of easy to see. So again, I'm going to quote the stop and search data in support of that. So black people, and this is well known, I think it's 9 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white people. But actually, most of that disparity happens in London. The disparity does not happen in actually quite a large number of parts of the country. So again, I'm not quoting that to justify or excuse anything. It's just important to get a handle on exactly what's going on. And I think you find similar differences in terms of outcomes for ethnic minority communities in different parts of the country. So things can be very different in different places. Final point I wanted to mention, just in terms of things that you need to think about when looking at ethnicity data, is class and income, because quite often ethnic disparities are actually due to underlying poverty or underlying socioeconomic differences. Again, it doesn't mean they don't matter. It's just important in terms of understanding why they happen. So the main stat I wanted to quote in support of that is again about education. So if you look at kids on free school meals, that's kids whose parents are on benefits. Actually, attainment for white kids on benefits is worse than black kids on benefits. Not dramatically worse, but a bit worse. Again, that doesn't tell you there's not an issue about race, but it tells you that there are significant socioeconomic issues independently of race which make a difference as well. So what does that mean overall? I think there are sort of 3 things I try and say in terms of trying to make sense of ethnicity data and how to use it. One is, do use it. It's really useful. There's lots on the website I mentioned earlier that it's good to use. 2, interpret it with care, and do remember that it doesn't immediately tell you why. So the fact there is a disparity, that doesn't immediately tell you why the disparity is happening, and there might be a number of different reasons. Third thing to say is that I think the right way of going about finding out why is to look at other metrics and other data that have a bearing on the question of particularly age, geography, income, and class. So as I say, I know you'll be working in lots of different organisations, and some of the data you're looking at may be a bit more micro than some of the stuff the government's looking at, but I thought it'd be useful to run through the kinds of things that we think about when we're trying to make sense of all the data that we have. Final plug I wanted to get in at the end, just picking on a point that David made, is that separately from the website that I mentioned, we have a current project in my bit at the Cabinet Office called the Equality Data Programme, which is looking specifically at the relative importance of different factors like geography and race and gender and income in explaining particular outcomes. So we're trying to look at that very difficult analytical question and to understand, in terms of explaining why unemployment is higher or lower, are the most important factors ethnicity, are they geography, are they class, and to try and balance those things up. So that's not publicly available yet, but I'm hoping it will be in a few weeks. So look forward to seeing your reactions to that when it is available. That was all from
Marcus, will that be available on the website you mentioned?
A different website, because it's not primarily ethnicity data. So ethnicity data is a component, but it's also data about gender, age, disability, income, pay, all sorts of things.
So if you Google that equality data program, is it coming out, or who's sponsoring that? Is it coming out of Cabinet Office?
Cabinet Office, and ministerially it's Liz Truss.
Right. So that Googling those things should reveal those results in a couple of weeks.
Well, I can't promise a couple of weeks. I think October we'll stick with. Yeah.
All right, we'll give you a break on that one. So really helpful, Marcus. There are a lot of aspects there that we went through, and I think one of the things that stuck out for me is, make use of this data, and you've kindly referred people, and I'll give that name again just so people can jot it down. But the Ethnicity Facts and Figures website, if you Google that, you should get the correct link. And in there, the importance of using the data, but using it with care and interpreting it. I'm always mindful, because I have a sort of commercial background. I have been in the civil service. I did have a stint there at Ofwat, the water regulator. But I'm mindful that in a commercial context, remember there's this old story about a sales executive who was sent overseas to look at future markets, and he arrived somewhere and had a look around, and he worked for a shoe company or something, and they wanted to sell a range of sandals, and he sent back a memo saying, no one here wears sandals, so there's no market. I may as well pack up and go home. Whereas his colleague arrived and said, no one here is wearing sandals. This market is ripe. We need to get in. And so the data, as you said, Marcus, can tell you different things, can't it? Depending on what lens you bring, on how you interpret it, and the importance there of looking at other metrics as well. In my old strategy consulting days, we called that triangulation of the data. That's just, you use these words so you can get paid more. Your clients pay you more because you've got a fancy word. I think that one of the things I picked up from what you said, Marcus, was around this interpretation of COVID data. And I know that if we're able to be joined by Anit, he has an anecdote he'd like to share about that. But if he doesn't, then I might take the privilege of sharing that on his behalf, because I thought that was quite useful, and you might be able to unpack that a little bit, Marcus, too, around the assumptions that were made around why COVID mortality was different for different groups. And I also really picked up, and I'll come to Ian in a second, because what I want to do is take what Marcus said about these stats and this data, and then kind of operationalize that through Ian's lens, because I know, Ian, you've been looking at the use of data at a more micro level, haven't you, around the kind of team manager level, where it could be used, for example, in better recruitment practices. So we'd love to hear from you about that. But one last reflection I had was just, again, back to the interpretation bit, was training leaders to understand the difference between correlation and causation. The fact that a stats might appear to say something because these two things are linked, but are they linked because that one causes the other, or that something else in the background is causing it? And I don't think I could let this moment pass without referring to the race equality report that was published this year, because I was involved in a number of roundtables discussing that, and I know that some stakeholders are very disappointed to see what you referred to there, Marcus, around the differential education outcomes, that people from African heritage perform differently from Afro-Caribbean heritage in school, and therefore racism can't play a role because they're both black, which to me just seemed not to follow your advice, which is to actually look behind it properly at the causation, at the interpretation of that data, and not simply go, oh, well, that proves this point. So, Ian, did you want to help us unpack what Marcus shared about the importance of the data and how to use it, with some perhaps examples of how that actually works in practice?
Absolutely, David, and thanks to Marcus for a really sort of fascinating broad brush description of what's going on at Cabinet Office, particularly on the ethnicity side. I mean, I just a phrase comes to mind, and I think it sort of proves the point that we're all emphasising today. That if you're running a newspaper, content is king. I think today context is very much king, and I'm hearing that writ large from today's discussion. And again, just alighting on perhaps a different part of my world, which is as a local authority councillor at Westminster City Council. So going back to some of Marcus's points on ethnicity and population, local population impact. So central London, unsurprisingly, we have a very high proportion of BAME people living in the city of Westminster, just over a third of population generally. And then of course, as you drill down, you get down the age range, that of course expands, and a majority of children living here in Westminster are from those communities. So headline, let's go back to newspaper headlines, is significant number of BAME people living in Westminster. Alongside that, we have high sort of indices of social depredation, poverty, what have you, deep pockets of low life expectancy, particularly among some of the groups I've just mentioned, and wide disparities between some BAME communities and the general white population. So minority ethnic and poor issues concerned with life expectancy. So you would expect, you would perhaps think that given all of that Westminster would be not where it is in terms of social mobility indices. But I can actually report that we are historically at the top of the annual Social Mobility Commission Index of opportunity. And I think that again brings another context, a societal context, into the debate of what are the opportunities for those poor people from various backgrounds within a city like Westminster, in terms of having those opportunities to engage with local employers, pre-pandemic arguably, in terms of employment opportunities, placement opportunities, etc. So we're sort of we have a golden nugget of opportunity here in the city of Westminster, juxtaposed with some of the ethnic and social and demographic issues I was alluding to. So these contrasts often sort of butt up against each other. Just coming back to David's question of operationalising some of these points at a more managerial mid-management level. So I started out talking earlier about board accountability for reporting. So just drilling down within an organisational context, more within a sort of team-based setting, lots of evidence of how one can use reporting of data capture, data reporting, to drive behaviour change within an organisational setting. So the most obvious parameters around employment, recruitment, employment, promotion, some of which I alluded to earlier when I was talking about the black group, white group that I was involved with. So our line managers, team leaders, section heads, whomever, those that are accountable for making these day-to-day decisions on the makeup of the organisation, are they how are they operating within the policy frameworks of a particular organisation in terms of quality, equity, of opportunity around employment, for instance, and are different managers, different teams, different divisions, etc., producing different employee group profiles as a result of their employment practices. So again, I think you need to start to sort of shake out some of those aggregated data sets at a more local level, to start to do that compare contrast at a local level, to really see what's happening within different teams, and therefore that gets us into the learning from one part of the organisation to another.
What about the elephant in the room, which is GDPR, data privacy, disclosure rates? Because Marcus, the figures you quoted presuppose that we can identify the gender, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, etc. of participants. And where that's disclosed within an HR system, that's one avenue. But I've been doing some work recently on the Mansfield Rule, which is a rule that some organisations adhere to, where they commit to having at least 30% underrepresented lawyers in their pool for promotion and hiring. But it requires you to know who those 30% of underrepresented lawyers are, and if they haven't disclosed that, you know it's very difficult to know. And is it appropriate to use your own knowledge of that candidate if they've not disclosed officially? Now, gender is usually easier, isn't it? Because most systems will tell you, most HR systems across the public sector, you'll know whether someone has what gender they have put in the system. But beyond that, it gets very tricky, doesn't it? So do either of you have any, perhaps start with Ian and then come to Marcus, but do you have any thoughts on how we manage that, and how do we go forward using data when we know that it's sometimes incomplete, particularly when we bring it down to that smaller level? When we disaggregated it, you might end up with a very small number of people, and you can't access the data for privacy reasons.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent and very timely discussion, David, not least because an hour or so ago in my director team today, we were discussing the risks, as you've highlighted, some of the risks of introducing demographic data capture around our claimant data. So this is people who are suing the NHS for malpractice, maltreatment, regardless of causation and outcome of any investigation. And we don't do that currently. And I think there's a huge, being self-critical, blind spot within the NHS looking at basic demographic data. So one of the things we were discussing today was the extent of the data set around those protected characteristics. And yes, you're right, sexuality, sexual identity being perhaps an obvious example, possibly also disability, people perhaps being less confident or more reluctant to declare against those. That said, my point today in my previous meeting was actually we should not form an editorial or judgmental view about including or excluding those parameters. We should absolutely open up the opportunity to the in this case the claimant population, the patient population, to declare, providing, coming back to your point, David, providing anybody who does declare against it, those protected characteristics, they understand basic issues as you mentioned earlier around GDPR, data protection, privacy, and also what the data are going to be used for, and why we're interested in capturing this data. So I think, again, back to the context, one needs to explain to whether it's staff, members of the public, customers, whatever, why you're capturing the data in the first place.
Marcus, what's your perspective on this?
I'd agree with the points that have just been made. So I think one thing we've been interested in is the whole question of response rates on protected characteristics in different government departments, because obviously if a minority of people are ticking the box, then the data is inherently ropey. And one question that we've been interested in is why are the response rates so variable between different organisations and also across different protected characteristics, because they are within government at any rate. And I think what we found in some of the work we've done, I mean, this is about a year ago now, is that there are two things that seem to really matter in terms of improving response rates. So these very practical things, quite different from some of the stuff I was talking about statistical validity earlier. But one is communications. So why are we collecting this data and what are we going to do with it? And just giving people a clear sense of that. And the more sense you can give people, that it will obviously be used respecting privacy, etc., but it'll be used to drive positive change so that it actually gives people an incentive to tick the box. So comms is one thing. The second, and this may be more surprising, is the design of the form. Because I think we found that lots of departments' forms are hard to get on with, hard to understand, technically poorly designed so that people's computer crashes when they tick on the wrong box, and so people just give up at that point. And we can talk about grand strategy, but I think a lot of this is actually about getting some of the IT basics right around design and accessibility of forms. So I think that's something that's a sort of, it sounds like a little thing, but that is worth giving some attention to.
I think that's great advice, and I certainly know that systems as a whole, so Marcus, you talk about forms, but the form is usually located on a system, isn't it? Inside what people refer to as a system. It might be the HR system, it might be whatever, or it's a hub, or it's wherever, and you're invited to go in and upload your data. And so, the form, but also the system it sits in can be a barrier. And I've heard too many complaints about various systems.
Lots of the ones in government departments are frankly awful. And it's hard to address it without reforming the kind of HR system as a whole. But that is worth giving some attention to, in my view.
Yeah. So just two housekeeping points while we're motoring along at the moment. Anit, unfortunately, is really struggling to get to join us, and we're going to try and look at a solution to have him join this afternoon if possible. So I might share his anecdote in a moment, but also a reminder around questions. If you do have any questions you have a chance to put to our panel, please feel free to pop those in the Q&A and we'll deal with them. So first thing I'm going to do is share Anit's anecdote, and I may invite Marcus just to comment on this in particular, but Ian as well, if you're interested. I also want to flag too, by way of housekeeping, that I'll be asking you, Marcus and Ian, to leave our participants today with one thought at the end. It'll either be an action that you recommend, it could be a challenge or a question. And I think, to be fair to Marcus, he's already left about 8 really practical, actionable things, and 3 of them in particular around, look at the data, understand the data, why it's telling you what it is, and look at other data as well. Ian, you might want to think about what final thought you want to leave. So what Anit had noted is that in addition to his role with Network Rail, he's also a non-executive director at a NHS trust, which provides mental health services in East London and the home counties. And of course, East London's a diverse area with many different ethnic groups. When COVID started to have an impact, there were higher than national levels of infection rates. And you alluded to this, Marcus, in the data you shared. And in common with other parts of the country, it was more prevalent across the Black and Asian communities. And Anit made the note, that it was quite shocking to see early popular culture hypothesis that emerged that this was potentially to do with genetics, and that's the reason why those infection rates were higher. Whereas actually, further analysis has revealed that it's around communities with similar levels of deprivation, things around crowding, things around the nature of jobs, and that has an impact on COVID infection rates, and those were the real driver. So I wonder, Marcus, did you have any observations there around the kind of assumptions we might be tempted to make?
So a couple. So one is, I think it's hard to remember now how little we knew about COVID 14 months ago. So the fact that ethnic minority people were at greater risk came to light very early. And I think at the point it came to light, nobody knew why, if we were being honest. So theories of various different kinds proliferated in the absence of any actual data. So I think that partly explains why what you said happened. But I mean, in terms of actually why, the reasons I think are quite interesting. So our work suggests that the 2 key reasons why ethnic minority people have been at greater risk at different waves of COVID, though, as I said, the extent has been rather different at different points, are one, what the statisticians call professional exposure, which in plain English is the jobs that people do. So basically, ethnic minority people are overrepresented in every single frontline job, whether that's frontline NHS, social care, retail, transport, taxi driving, all of them. Ethnic minority people are more overrepresented, and that's an important part of the reason. Second one is to do with what the clinicians call comorbidities, i.e. underlying health conditions, which are more prevalent in ethnic minority communities than others. So I think that it's more complicated than that. It's a very complicated issue, but those are the 2 key factors. And I suppose what I'd say is that to actually be clear about that and to establish those well in research, and I think those are reasonably well established now, was a lot of work and took a lot of time. In time we didn't have any, so perhaps it's not surprising that some of those other theories proliferated in the meantime, but I'm not aware of any evidence that there's a genetic component at all. So
we know nature abhors a vacuum, so if there isn't an explanation readily available, then people will supply one, won't they, whether it's based in fact or data or not. We've got a question that's come through, so I was going to share that. But Ian, did you want to chip anything in on that before we move to the question?
Yeah, just building on Marcus's point, and you're absolutely correct, Marcus. It's a narrative that's been played out well and increasingly clearly, increasingly so in the sort of mainstream media. I mean, if you look at it through an LGBT lens, however, you might well argue that this is an area that is not yet both sufficiently public, as in it's not above the watermark, if you will. It's still a hidden factor as far as impact of the pandemic on those minority populations is concerned. And how that then, going back to the intersection point I was mentioning earlier, how that compares with some of the BAME debate. So, for example, we do know that historically, traditionally, obviously making a general point to make the point that members of the LGBTQ community are reluctant to come forward to present in many sort of healthcare settings, often based on previous inappropriate or poor handling by healthcare professionals. Lots of evidence around that if you look at the government's survey of 2019. So you need, again, back to the context, really key here. But you need to be mindful that it's not only necessarily an ethnic issue. There may be other gain protected characteristics, people from those minority communities who are suffering in a similar or comparable way in terms of not coming forward for vaccinations or treatment.
And there's I'm mindful I was at the launch of the LGBT National Survey, the report that came out of that. I think it was 2018, wasn't it, at the Oval. I was used to going there to watch cricket, and instead I was going there to watch some ministers unveil this research. And as you say, Ian, that revealed clearly there were patterns around access to healthcare, but also the experience of people, trans people, for example, quite reluctant often to go to the NHS or to a GP to seek treatment because there are barriers they face in just the basics of being called by the correct pronouns with the correct names, the sort of invasive and inappropriate questions that are asked. And I know LGBT people who are supposedly powerful and privileged also experience that. A friend of mine wanted to go and get some treatment at the NHS to do with sexual health, and was barraged with invasive questions and then given a really inappropriate response when they disclosed answers to that, and kind of made to feel very ashamed by that person. So yeah, a bit of work to be done there, but mindful that the NHS is an enormous organisation. In fact, it's I think the biggest employer in the UK. So you can't get it right all the time. So here are two questions. The first one's come in from Deborah Daniels, and it is this. And actually, it takes us back to the start when I made those comments around data versus lived experience. So it's a really good question. Thank you for that one, Deborah. It's this. If we use statistics to drive change, individual concerns are reduced to numbers only. So don't we lose the human element of the concern or the reason why something's not happening? And so it's that impact of it's great that we get the data, but then we lose the story behind the data in some ways, don't we? And that human impact and human element. So either of you, would you like to sort of jump in first?
I agree strongly with the thought behind the question, is what I would say. My answer to the question David posed about is data or lived experience more important, is that they're both important, and it's really a false opposition. I actually think the bits of work I've been involved with which have been strongest are ones where there have been really strong quantitative data backed by really good qualitative work. So you actually understand the people that you're trying to help, and they feel a sense of agency and involvement with the work. So I'm in kind of both and territory on the kind of qualitative and quantitative stuff. That if you're doing an effective piece of work, you'll look at both. So I agree.
I was about to say the same thing. I think it's not either or, but absolutely both. Yeah.
I mean, my experience of this, I've been working with data for decades and with senior leaders, and we often joke, don't we, around the different personality types. This leader's a sort of numbers person, or this one is interested in the human element, as if, like you said, they're kind of divorced from each other. And I think slowly I'm seeing a change of mindset amongst leaders, that they're more alive to the fact that it is both. there are shortfalls on the anecdote side, aren't there? If you talk about lived experience all the time, it can give you a very skewed sense of what's happening. So you do need both, don't you? And a new kind of leader, perhaps. And I know that the civil service has been, following procedures, policies, looking at processes for a long time. And is starting to then think more about, okay, what do these things mean? How do they translate into what happens in the workplace and people's experience? Interestingly, later today, we're going to be hearing some very interesting anecdotes from people around disparities between what data say and what actually happens. One example being the diversity data around Black employees within a part of the public sector looked pretty good. But in fact, Black people were simply not being promoted. So if you cut the data by seniority, and to Marcus's point, okay, partly that could be driven by age differences in the communities, but nevertheless, it really showed that Black people were not being promoted at the same rate. So we have another question now that's come in. This is quite a long one, so strap yourselves in for this. But I think it's worth reading the whole thing because it's quite rich. But it's a reasonably simple question, so I will make it really obvious what the question is. So the question comes in and says, diversity can be the easier target when it comes to measuring and managing the data, whereas it's difficult to produce lasting long-term effects without also tackling inclusion. And this point was actually made earlier today, where we said actually some organizations where they're very diverse, but they lack inclusion, perform worse than very homogenous organizations. So inclusion is, of course, a far less tangible characteristic of a workforce. It's deeply embedded in social norms, organization culture, and unconscious biases that can be very difficult to describe, let alone measure. It's often targeted through initiatives such as training and seminars, appointing inclusion champions and sponsors, or even just hiring for diversity and hoping that the company culture will change with it. These, which we know not to be true by and large. These initiatives are certainly helpful and should be part of any D&I strategy, but without capturing the right data, how do we know if they're even working? So to summarize the question, what it's saying is, it seems to be easier to measure diversity, and we can set targets around that, but how do we measure inclusion? And how do we know that the things we're trying to do to create inclusion are working? So who's game to tackle that question?
I'll go first, and I'll happily then go to Marcus. But I think a lot of this comes back to corporate culture, and ultimately the kind of apex of the organisation. I think, David, it's around leadership and setting the right behaviour, setting the right tone, setting the right expectations, if you will, around what are we going to do, and it's back to making the difference. So I know that today's conference is not around the broader ED&I agenda. Much of it's a valid frame through which to discuss the stats here in this framework. But I think it's important to really sort of look at, again, back to what difference are we seeking to make. I would just query, I think the question was from Young Kid Man. I just query Ian's earlier point around talking about the emphasis on inclusion. I think the emphasis needs to be much more around equity within that broader ED&I framework. And this is around ensuring appropriate, targeted and measurable impacts among all audiences or groups or population segments that are at risk of being left behind or excluded.
Well, then again, I agree with the thought behind the question, in the sense that if you have an organisation which isn't very effective or is possibly dysfunctional, if all you do is you change the faces around the top table so that they are more diverse, but you don't change anything about the organisation, including the things that aren't working well in it, then you're not going to change a whole lot, I would say. So, I mean, if that's the thought behind the question, then I think I would strongly agree with that. So, diversity is important, but it doesn't of itself automatically change things for the better. And there are many other things you need to do as well. I mean, inclusion is one of them, but I think I would say there are others too to improve an organisation. So, I guess I'm in both and space again and agree. Great.
Thank you both. I think I like, Ian, you flagged the idea, well, let's not just stop at inclusion. Let's think about equity. We often now think about things through a belonging lens, don't we? We sort of say, well, inclusion is one thing, but do you actually feel that you belong? I extended that even further. My obsession for the last couple of years has been around love. and the role of love in the workplace. And I think this would be shocking within the public sector. You know, how dare the civil service talk about love? That's unprofessional. It's not part of our ethos and so on. But, you know, if an employee has a true sense of being loved, and that is a reflection of how they belong and how they feel they belong, then there is research, right, Marcus? There are stats around showing how much more productivity there is, how much less likely you are to leave the organization, the reduction in sick days. It's 50% reduction in sick days where people have a strong sense of belonging in an organization. So there's a little thought I'm leaving with you. Now, before we go to your closing thoughts, where I'm going to ask Marcus and Adam and Ian to share, you know, one point for our delegates to take away. I just want to run a really quick scenario by you and just get a yes, no on it. So within the public sector, do you think this would ever be viable? In the private sector, there is, I have colleagues who are very good at harvesting data, and they can harvest metadata. In other words, when do your employees log on? In the old days, when do they come into the office and use their pass to swipe in and out? When do they log onto their laptop? When do they read their first email? All of those sort of things. They can be monitored to look for trends over time. And using predictive analytics, they claim that 6 to 12 months before someone is going to leave, you can find out and provide a warning to their manager, to their leaders, saying this person is at risk of leaving or potentially at risk. And we can help those who are from diverse backgrounds, because they tend to be the ones who leave more. Is that something that would ever be usable within the public sector, or is it far too big brother? And remember, this is only metadata, so we're not looking at the contents of people's email, but we're looking at when they send their emails. And if a pattern changes, that's a trigger to say, oh, there's a red flag here. Is that something you could ever see being used?
Can I go on a limb here and say I hope not?
Okay, that's fine. That's all you need to say. Ian, what are your thoughts on that? Could it help the NHS?
Just a broad comment. I'm going to slightly sort of evade the question. I guess it's the politician in me, forgive me. But I mean, I think you know, looking in the context of the rapid shift to hybrid working. Interesting stuff in today's FT on this. You know, it may well be that there is a legitimacy of, you know, tracking behaviours within that context. So, you know, in terms of, you know, the closest proximity of where staff are seated in an open office environment, given the current context of social distancing, for example, and the change of that over time. So whether you want to label it social monitoring or what have you, I don't know. Providing, really key point, providing it's transparent and it gets agreement from staff. I think doing it surreptitiously is a complete no-no, and that will be undermine trust as well.
Thank you. So, Ian, what's your parting point that you'd like to share with our delegates today?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, to thank you for your stewardship, David, and also Marcus for your really interesting insights. And I will certainly check out your website that you mentioned earlier on. I'm going to return to where I began, and I just want to make the point, and it's a simple point, but I think it's a useful point of reference for people to have mentally going forward around polarities. I think it's a useful way of just framing the whole discussion around where data fit in, data and analysis fit into this whole discussion. So just a few very simple examples. You know, we talked earlier on around corporate aggregated data sets versus you know, what's happening at the coalface of the departmental level. So that's one example of a polarity. We've had a question today come in around the use and the differences of aggregated anonymized data sets versus the individual and richness of looking at individual lived experience. And then I think, very obvious point, forgive me, the blend of both the quant and the qual as well. So my parting shot, David, is think in those polarities.
And Marcus?
So my final thoughts, I know I already made this point, but I just want to make it again, just because I think it is practical and actionable, is tick the box and give other people a good reason to do it. And that's an important way of driving up, from a statistical point of view, they call this data quality. So it's just interesting that people can argue a great deal about statistics, which are actually quite ropey because the underlying response rate was only 40%. You need to get it to 90% to be usable.
Yeah. Marcus Bell from the Cabinet Office and Ian Adams from NHS Resolution. Thank you both for a very rich conversation. We look forward potentially to having Anit join us later today, but we'll see what we can do there by way of that. But thank you both. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And it's now time for our delegates to go and get lunch, and we'll see you back here at 2 p.m.